Hello there. My name is Dennis Kidder. I'm W6DQ. I'm going to be sharing a story with you today about the recovery of one of the largest broadcast transmitters ever constructed by the Collins Radio Company. In November of last year, in an interview by George, KJ6VU, and Mike, VA3MW for Ham Radio Workbench with W6DQ, we started talking about this project of preserving this transmitter, this Collins transmitter, and how we went about getting that and extracting it from the Voice of America site and putting it on display at the Antique Wireless Association Museum. Well, we thought it would be a nice idea to provide some more information on that story, give it a little bit more detail, some of the background, and even share some photographs of the work we did for BayNet. So that's what we're doing here today. Now, a little bit about me. I was licensed in 1969 as a novice. I rapidly moved up to my advanced and eventually my extra, and was granted the call sign W6DQ of one of my Elmers from my high school days, which is, I'm so proud of. It's just wonderful that I was able to do that. I've always had an interest in Collins radio. You might see behind me, we're sitting in my ham shack here today. One of my Collins S lines, and one of the pieces of equipment in that S line, that 75S3, I purchased in 1969, soon after I got my license. Still use it. It's a daily driver. We love Collins. So the Collins Collectors Association, of course, we're all about preserving and recording the history of Collins, and a group of us got together to perform this project. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that now, how that came about, and what the status of the transmitter is today, which is quite wonderful. So without further ado, I am going to move over to my slides. Here we go. So the Voice of America, of course, and we're specifically talking about Delano Relay DL-8. That's the name of the transmitter. But I'm going to start out by giving you a little background on Voice of America, like what it is. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard, listened to, or know of the Voice of America. And of course, this is shortwave transmissions. I know as I was a kid, I used to listen to Voice of America, probably listening to Delano Relay, if none of the others. But this is the official U.S. federal government's external broadcast entity, meaning it's not for audiences here in the continental United States, but outside of the United States. So it's operated under the United States Agency for Global Media, USAGM, and it's one of 5 civilian U.S. international broadcasters. They provide programming on radio, television, as well as on the internet, and produce something like 1,800 hours weekly in 47 different languages. Their global weekly audience numbers more than 278 million people, and they maintain 19 major transmitting sites worldwide. Now, one of the facilities is still in existence and still operating. Of course, that is the currently the Edward R. Murrow transmitting facility in Greenville, North Carolina, but there's also another transmitting facility off the west coast of Africa, the island of Sao Tome, and they primarily do medium wave broadcasts to Central Africa from the coast there. But formerly, there were many other sites, including what was called Bethany Relay, which is located near Cincinnati, Ohio, and is now a museum, Voice of America Museum. Of course, Delano Relay, which is what we're talking about, which was located or is located in the town of Delano, or city of Delano, roughly halfway between Bakersfield and Fresno here in Central California along Highway 99. In fact, if you've driven up Highway 99 north of Bakersfield, you can't help but notice the huge antenna farm, which is several miles off to the west side of the highway. Lastly, there are the relays. There was Dixon, which is now gone, of course, and it was located near Sacramento, also in the Central Valley. There are also numerous other broadcast facilities, Hawaii, Okinawa, Liberia, Costa Rica, and Belize, to name a few of those. So in their history, VOA started on the shortwave during World War II. In fact, their transmissions, the first transmissions were called Voices from America. They were targeted towards Germany, and it went into operation on February 1st, 1942 as Stimmen aus Amerika, Voices from America. Now, over the years, they maintained a lot of shortwave broadcasting. And of course, as you know, shortwave broadcasters their numbers are dwindling. We don't see as much shortwave anymore these days. And it's the impact of technology, of course. That's what's done this. The proliferation primarily of the internet. But the Voice of America still does, as I mentioned earlier, does maintain broadcast services that are still remaining for Africa. But their medium wave and shortwave broadcasting facilities are no more. They've gone over to the internet, as I mentioned. So their internet services, believe it or not, Voice of America was the first broadcast news organization on the internet in 1994. So they have that distinction. Still, today they broadcast, as I mentioned earlier, in English and 46 additional languages. And as resources, they maintain 20,000 servers in 71 countries. Quite an infrastructure. So Voice of America Delano, one of the last relay facilities. This is a relay transmitting site. And its history began in the May of 1944. They broke ground on the facility. And believe it or not, by November of 1944, the first rhombic was on the air, up in the air, 170 feet, and they were on the air. This was the first of the 3 relay sites that they built. The others being Bethany and Dixon, as I mentioned earlier. They also established a receive site a little ways up the road in the town of Pixley. Now, the reason for the receive site, this wasn't their primary method of moving program material from the studios in Washington, D.C. out to the transmitting facilities. They mainly relied on the Bell System's landline facilities of the time. Well, they were concerned about the reliability and the availability of the Bell System. Should they go down, they still wanted to be able to get their program material. So they established this receive site. Believe it or not, in their entire history, they never had to use those receivers other than for testing. They did regular testing. The Bell System, the landlines stayed up. They were always available, and they had a great history with the Bell System. Well, sadly, on October 27th, 2007 at 8:30 p.m., their last transmission took place. It was a scheduled program on 5890 kilohertz in Thai. Station shut down. No special observance was made for 63 years of service. It just shut down, turned everything off, dropped what they were doing, and walked away. So starting in 1944, I've got a couple of pictures of the early construction and some photographs of their facility there from the old days. But this is one of the 200-foot towers that support a dipole curtain array. It's one of the arrays you can see from the highway. There's 3 towers that support it. And you can see one of the footings being constructed there, one of the towers under construction also on the right-hand side there. In the early days, their transmitter lineup consisted of a 200 kilowatt Federal transmitter, one of those guys, 3 50 kilowatt RCA transmitters, and eventually they had 2 General Electric 100 kilowatt transmitters. Those went away to be replaced by the 3 Collins 821A1 250 kilowatt transmitter, like we're talking about today. And there were 4 Brown Bovary SK53 250 kilowatt transmitters. Those are now on the air in the Philippines. They were sold to another broadcast entity who currently has them operating out there. And in addition, there were 2 Continental 50 kilowatt single sideband transmitters that were located at the site. So in the early days, these are some early photographs. These are the upper photographs of the control room. And the control room on the right shows transcription turntables. So the material would have been transmitted from Washington, D.C. studios out to this site, recorded on a transcription disc, and then played back for retransmission to the remote sites through that. And of course, eventually the transcription turntables were replaced by reel-to-reel tape decks. And you see a set of Ampex tape decks there that they used. On the bottom is a photograph of the portion of the facility. You can see those 3 towers in the background. Those are the 3 that were being constructed in the earlier photographs. And of course, the building itself as it looked in those days from the front, from the east side. Well, in 1964, the building was expanded. And this was with the Voice of America contracting with Collins Radio Company to build these 821A1s. They built 9 of them for the Voice of America. 3 were located at each of the relay stations. Well, they had to make room for that, of course. So they built an extension on to the east side of the building, and you see the 2 stories there. The bottom floor is where the transmitters are located, the 3 821A1s, as well as the 2 Continentals. And that second story is for the cooling equipment for those transmitters. As you might imagine, 3 250 kilowatt transmitters, as well as 2 50 kilowatt transmitters, produced a lot of waste heat. So we had to get rid of that. So that's what the second floor housed. Well, let's talk a bit about where we got started with this thing, following the Delano shutdown. The Voice of America transferred the facilities to the GSA. Now, in the case of Delano, the GSA is looking for a new owner for the property. There's some 800 acres with a bunch of structures on it. They're trying to find a buyer. They're looking for either a private buyer or a government buyer. Well, they weren't having much luck with that. Dixon had already been sold. As it turns out, the Delano site, it was discovered by the California Department of Fish and Game that an endangered species of a shrew has taken up residence on that property, and therefore they were forbidden to demolish the facility. How do you like that? So Delano still stands. Although there's a lot of it's been gutted, the facilities are still there, all the towers are still there. They can't do anything until that gets settled in. I'm not sure what they'll do with it, but Delano was looking to use it for a regional airport or expand their prison that's located in town there. They thought about using it as a homeless shelter. Well, like I said, Dixon sold. It was sold to a farmer up there in the Dixon area, and Bethany, of course, is now the Voice of America Museum there near Cincinnati. Well, 2 members of the Collins Collectors Association, Bill Carnes, N70TQ, and Jim Stitzinger, WA3CEX, came up with this idea. Why not try and preserve one of these transmitters? Get it into a museum somewhere, rather than letting it end up in a landfill bulldozed to the ground as scrap metal. So the Collins Collectors Association embarks on this project to seek to obtain one of the 821A1 transmitters. So working with the GSA, this is how they found out that it had been transferred from the VOA to the GSA. We figured that it would be good, maybe display at the Antique Wireless Association and or the Collins Museum in Cedar Rapids. Well, Antique Wireless Association was right on board with us. They were very excited about being able to obtain one of these transmitters for display. So they were right in the middle of this with us. So GSA eventually agreed, but they levied some conditions. And oh, what conditions they were. First, we had to have the transmitter off the site within 2 weeks after starting. And oh, by the way, you need to have it on display within 18 months. Okay, well, we had our timetable. So let's talk a little bit about the transmitter. This is quite a piece of hardware. Of course, you're all familiar, I hope, with Collins Radio. They're now part of United Technologies. And this little transmitter here, the mighty Collins 821A1, was a 250 kilowatt auto-tuned shortwave transmitter. This is important to note. Why is auto-tune important? Well, let's talk about this a bit. This transmitter was able to tune between 3.95 and 26.5 kilocycles, retune to full output on any frequency within 20 seconds. Why? Consider the time. This is the mid-60s. We're in the midst of the Cold War. We're waging a propaganda war with the behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union and their allies. The Soviet Union is actively jamming transmissions. Well, if you look at a conventional transmitter, such as those that might be used for jamming, it takes some time to retune one of those when you change frequency. It's 10 to 25 minutes. Normally, it could take an hour or more to retune a transmitter to a new frequency to be able to jam this shortwave broadcast. So having a transmitter that could tune up in 20 seconds instead of an hour is quite an accomplishment and gives you that much more airtime to get your program material out to the remote sites before you're jammed. So you can understand the reason that the Voice of America wanted this equipment, and Collins was able to provide that. These guys averaged, from looking at their logbooks, about 4 frequency changes per day per transmitter. So 3 transmitters, 4 changes a day per transmitter, 12 changes. So moving around quite a bit during the day. I mentioned this before. This was the most powerful transmitter ever offered by Collins Radio as a shortwave broadcast transmitter, the 821A1. They were working on a higher power model, but they never finished that project. Well, let's go back to May of 2014. This is when we began our project. Our team arrived at the Delano site, consisting of some folks I mentioned before, Bill Carnes and 70TQ, Jim Stitzinger, WA3CEX, with his assistant, his employee that works for him, Tim. Vince Maker from the Voice of America, who is an invaluable asset to us throughout the course of this whole project. Vince really helped us, and we were so happy to have him on site. Of course, that was a requirement of the Voice of America to have Vince there. Vince was there daily, whether we were there or not. Vince was still working for the Voice of America as kind of a caretaker at the facility. We also had Rod Bloxham, N0DAS. Now, Rod was one of the principal designers of the HF80 system and drew a lot of its design from this transmitter, this 821A1, done in the 60s. Also on the team is Scott Kerr, who was the president of the Collins Collectors Association at the time, KE1RR. We had another member of Collins Collectors Association, Brian Garrick, KE6IYC, as well as Dave Jennings, WJ6W. And some of you may recognize that call sign. Dave is a well-known amateur AM user here on the West Coast and operates often all the time on 75 meters AM, a beautiful signal out of the San Fernando Valley here in Southern California. And of course, yours truly, W6DQ. And so begins the relocation of Delano DL-8. Now, if you've ever been to the Delano site, I'm sure some of you have probably visited the site. You might recognize this next photograph. This is as you come in the main entrance, this is the first gallery. You can see those 2 Continentals there on the left-hand side. And behind the wall, behind those Continentals are the 3 Collins transmitters. As you go through the door, this is what you might see. This is DL-8 in the flesh. That's it. This is essentially the control console for the transmitter, as well as the drivers and all the tuning controls and everything located right there. Now, at the other end, far end of that hall, is the control room. And this is where you have remote control of all the audio and transmitting facilities there. So we relocated all of this equipment as well. Nothing was left behind. This was all part of what went to the AWA. So as we go back to the transmitter, this is kind of a shot showing an image showing the front of the transmitter, which you saw in the earlier photograph. And it also shows the cage behind it where the actual transmitter is housed, the PA, the modulator, and things like that. And this extends some 60 feet behind that front row of racks to the power supply, which is an entire room. So let's take a little bit closer look at some of these things here. We walk around the corner. This is actually the output matching network, part of it. And this converts the coaxial feed from the PA into a balanced feed out to the antenna farm, the switching yard. So looking up in the air, we can see what look like 2 air lines or maybe a steam pipes or something. Those are actually 2 pieces of coax that form the balanced line through shields there. You see it go up and over the top. They're about, what, maybe 6 or 8 inches in diameter, and they drop down into what looks like a piece of air conditioning duct. That air conditioning duct is actually the housing and shielding for that balanced line that runs out to the antenna farm, the switch yard, and the antennas. So it's protecting the personnel because it runs through the building where there'd be a lot of people, offices, and things like that. So we walk a little bit farther and we see inside this transmitter cage that you saw earlier, this is actually the PA housing. This houses the two final transmitting tubes. They're a IMAC 3CV 100,000C transmitting tube. They're tetrodes. They are what are called vapor phase cool, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. But that's the actual transmitter, the housing for the transmitter. If we walk around the corner to the left, we'll see the modulator. Two more of those 4CV 100,000 Cs, the vapor phase cooled tube, they're located in this modulator. Now the two in the modulator run in push-pull, while the two in the PA run as parallel. And here's a little close-up shot of that tube. This thing weighs about 95 pounds. It's a very heavyweight tube. Now it's not water cooled. It's actually what they call vapor cooled. It's cooled by steam. It sits in a tub of water. The water boils off as steam. The steam is carried away to a condenser that's located up in that second floor, and it returns as water back to the cooling tub to be recycled. The continuous cycle there. So you can see the corrosion. You know, this thing's been sitting in water. It's been sitting there since 2007 was the last time this thing was fired up. So there's a bit of corrosion on there. So I mentioned Vince Baker before as being such an asset to us. We are disassembling this equipment and trying to figure out how to get those tubes out of the tubs. You know, we see there's a rail overhead, but we don't see any way to extract the tube. It's bolted in. We remove the screws that hold it down, remove all of that. We remove the socket, which you see behind the tube there. Pardon me. But we don't see any way to extract the tube. There's a socket on the top of the tube that some kind of a locking fixture goes into that you could remove it. Well, we pull out the manuals, which we happen to have, and we're looking through there. It talks about the maintenance instructions and things like that. And we see this picture of this little winch assembly. And we're talking to Vince, and we don't see this around anywhere. Vince says, hey, you know, that looks familiar. I've seen those around here somewhere. I think I know where those are. Vince runs off. A little while later, he comes back with a whole bunch of these winches that were located out in a storage building out on the other side of the property. So it really made it easy to remove those tubes. Thankfully, we had to pull out the four. We pulled out all the tubes actually from all of the transmitters, and they were sent off to the museum. They're on display along with their maintenance cart and a few other things that went along. But a nice story. We're really grateful for Vince being there. Without him, we probably never would have gotten those tubes out. So here we are wheeling that modulator off to the staging area to be packed up and shipped. There's Rod and Scott trying to manhandle that thing out of the cage there. This is the actual PA itself. We've removed the racks across the front that you saw earlier, and what's left here is the PA cabinet. Now the tubes and the cast aluminum tub that they sit in, that's part of the cooling system, those are all removed. What remains are the filament supply and the screen supply, as well as the output matching section, which is the thing going up vertically in the background there. We'll get to in a second. This is quite a machine. So I mentioned the matching section. This is, on the left-hand side, is the output of the PA cabinet. And it goes into this, what is called a Piline Section. Piline Section is an interesting creation by Warren Breeny, who was the principal engineer on this system, the design of the 821A1. He came up with a concept for tuning the output of this transmitter by what he calls this Piline Section. It's basically a section of coax that periodically uses a variable capacitor between the center conductor and the shield to tune that coax to the resonant frequency and perform the impedance matching. Well, when you look at this picture, your first impression might be that that piece of copper pipe is the center conductor, but it wouldn't have a choke in the middle of it like that. That's actually the high voltage feed to the PA coming in from the high voltage power supply. The center conductor of the coax is actually that box that the cover's off of, that the copper pipe is inside of. That's the center conductor of the coax. And that's probably about 18 inches square, maybe something like that is how big that is. It's a pretty good sized box. The shield is the outer enclosure. And if you look in the right-hand photograph, you see those four disc things there. Those are actually vacuum variables that are used to tune that section of coax in the Piline Section. And there's a number of those located throughout this enclosure, and they're all servo controlled. They're all controlled by remote control to tune the transmitter. So next photograph shows a little bit more overall of what this thing looks like as we get a better view of it. You can see in the center is where that PA cabinet was located. We've removed that. You can see how it goes up in the air. The coax goes over the top. You can see the shield. The center conductor's been removed up there, and it comes down on the left-hand side into the enclosure that I showed earlier, the output section. And you can see some of the covers are off. I'll give you some close-ups of that in a moment and talk about that a little bit. So this is on the left-hand side. This is actually a balun. This is where you go from the coax feed from that Piline section to the balanced feed going out to the switch yard and the antenna farm. And basically what it does is it takes two pieces of coax. You saw the two pieces of coax going out the top of that matching unit. Well, the single coax coming in is split, and one section goes directly up with its own matching network. The other section goes through a phase inverter, and the phase inverter is so clever. I was just amazed looking at this. You could see the phase inverter, which is located right here. And what it does is it takes the input coax, takes the center conductor, and connects it to the shield of the outgoing coax. And the shield of this incoming coax is connected to the center conductor of the outgoing coax. So it basically does a 180-degree phase reversal, so you get a balanced feed from this. So in a sense, this is a balun. On the right-hand side, Rod is grinning up on the ladder, is holding a section of that shielding, the duct that looks like the air conditioning duct, that was holding the balanced feed line going out to the outside. One of the interesting things we discovered as we pulled this ducting down, you guys are going to be familiar with this, a W2AU balun. Now, I've used those since I was first licensed. My first dipole had a W2AU balun back in 1969. Well, there's a W2AU balun hooked up to the balanced feed line in here. And we're looking at that. It's got a couple of high megohm resistors tying it into the balanced feed, and it's extracting that out to a piece of RG58 that goes off to the control room. And the best we could figure, that was probably their modulation monitor. They were watching the waveforms on the output and monitoring their modulation levels to see that they had a good, clean waveform. Very clever use of a W2AU balun. I really loved that. That was cool. So I mentioned the servos on those vacuum variables. Here's another view as we extract those assemblies out of the tuning section. What you see here are the vacuum variables down on the bottom, and then you see all the mechanism up on the top, including the servo motors. These are the servo motors right here, these two units. And of course, the drive mechanisms, the chain drives, and the drive screws for the vacuum variables located down here. Now, all these hoses, you might wonder what those are. Well, believe it or not, these are water-cooled variable capacitors, water-cooled. And they ran chilled water through these capacitors to keep them from overheating and failing. Now, we're talking about high power. We're really talking about some high power. You know, you think about it, 250 kilowatts, that's your carrier. With 100% modulation, your output actually is 4 times that, or 1 megawatt. That's what this thing puts out on peak power, 1 megawatt. That's a lot of soup. And accidents are bound to happen. As we were walking around and looking at the feed up there, that matching section overhead, we spotted this. And I say that's a little bit of slag. What you see there is where one of the fixed capacitors, it was still a vacuum capacitor, it's a fixed capacitor, was bolted to the shield, which is the piece of metal you're looking at, and the center conductor. And at some time or another, there was a major arc over, and you can see it created a bit of slag there. This is actually on the inside. We first spotted it on the outside. You can see this bubble of aluminum sticking out of the enclosure. Well, a little later, we were going through the logbooks, and we found an entry in the logbook that says, attempted to tune transmitter on 20 something megacycles. And over in the notes, the engineer had written, "Don't ever do that again." We have to believe that this was the result of that. But whether that's really what happened or not, this is just an amazing display of how much power we're talking about here. While we're speaking about high power and high voltage, this is something we saw quite frequently, and with good reason. You know, this thing's running at 15,000 volts, 15 kilovolts. A lot of soup. I mentioned that. So you definitely have, there are chicken sticks everywhere to ground this baby. Well, speaking about power, how about a power supply that you can actually walk inside of? Wow. What you see there from left to right, on the left-hand side is the plate supply, transformers and rectifiers. In the center is the modulator supply and modulation transformer and modulation reactor. And off on the right, those are the filter capacitors for the PA plate supply. So looking at it from a little bit different angle, looking at the plate, oh, and the modulator, you see in a row there, there's the filter capacitors for the modulator. Next are the rectifiers, three-phase rectifier bank, the modulator power transformer, the modulation transformer, and then a modulator reactor. That is the modulator side. On the PA side, what you see here is the high voltage transformer. It's a three-phase transformer supplying PA voltage to a three-phase rectifier that's immersed in oil, 148 gallons of oil to be exact. And off to the left is a general purpose utility transformer that takes the 5160 volts AC on the input three-phase and gives us 220 or probably 208 three-phase and 115 utility for other systems here. So this is big stuff. That one plate transformer weighs 5,000 pounds. 5,000 pounds. Yikes. So moving outside the building, this is the feed lines going out to on the way out to the switch yard. And what you see here, there's that air conditioning duct right there, up there in the upper right. And here's the balanced feed lines coming out. There you can see the vents from the cooling area. These are where the cooling fans and condensers are located. So there's the three outputs of the 821A1s. Then these two here, one here and one here, those are coax coming from the 50 kilowatt Continentals. And of course, to convert that coaxial output over to a balanced feed, there's another balun. That balun looks about the size of a pole pig that you see on the power line outside your house from the utility company. That's a big balun, 50 kilowatts. It's a biggie. So this is the feed. Now, continuing on, if we follow the feed lines, they go to the first switch yard. And here is the first switch yard. And in the background, you can see one of the towers from that curtain array I showed before, the dipole curtain array. And there's two towers that support another dipole curtain array. And there's also feeds going off to the right that feed one of the fields of the rhombics. And let's see, what have I got next here? The next picture is of that 3-bay curtain array, or 3-section. Each section has a number of bays within it. That is that was one of the first arrays that was put up at the site back there in the 40s. You saw the pictures of being erected, the tower put up, and the footings being poured. So this is kind of an overall view looking at that. And in the background of that shot, that image, is one of the newer antenna arrays. Those towers are 400 feet tall, the tallest ones. And then the three others are 200 feet tall, the same height as these three guys here. I got a little close-up of the feed going up that curtain array. You can see some elements. These are the dipole elements here. And you can see they're kind of like fanned out, and that's kind of like a cage dipole to help make it more broadband. And of course, the dipole array consists of it's a matrix of dipole elements, both horizontal and vertical, that you can switch in and out to change the operating frequency and tune the antenna. That is the whole purpose. You can change the phasing between the bays to steer the array as well. So that's a little bit of the feed. This next photograph is that later antenna was put up. The two antennas. This is a shortwave array, the shorter towers at 200 feet, and this is the medium wave array broadcast, kind of like broadcast frequencies, the 400-foot towers. So these are big towers, huge. I've got some pictures of the switch yard, some pieces of the switch yard, some of the phasing lines, give you an idea of what some of this stuff looks like. And this is feeding up into the this dipole curtain array that we were looking at. These are the 400-foot tall towers. So the switches, here's a close-up, sort of close-up of the switches. These are pneumatically operated switches. And you can see the feed lines here. This is a copper pipe. And there's 3 switches. There's one here, one here, one over here. And again, some of the phasing lines, what have you. Quite a complicated system. Now, just to put this tower in scale, 400-foot tower, that's a big tower. I like this next photograph. Here's Rod, N0DAS, standing next to one of the equalizers for those towers. That is huge. That's big hardware. You know, we're used to, my towers here, you know, mine have a turnbuckle so big, you know, 8 inches, 10 inches long. Those things are huge. Those guys are like 2 inches in diameter. That's massive hardware. Well, we finished our tour of the antenna farm, and that was quite exciting. I mean, there's some interesting stuff to see out there. And we headed back to the hall. And of course, we went back to the hall. What do we find back there? Everything's gone. We'd cleaned the place up. That transmitter is gone. We moved it out to a staging area out in another part of the building. We palletized and shrink wrapped everything. And the next step was loadout. Here's Jim Stitzinger with his forklift, loading a set of racks into an 18-wheeler. And we hauled all this gear off to Bloomfield, New York, to the Antique Wireless Association Museum. There it is, all packed up, ready to go. And I have to share a photo of our team. Here's the remaining team after we got everything out. We've got Vince Baker there on the left from Voice of America, Rod Bloxham. Next, myself, W6DQ, Dave Jennings, Jim Stitchinger holding a roll of engineering drawings of the transmitter, and his assistant, Tim. So we just had, you know, this was quite an exciting project. Kind of a once-in-a-lifetime thing to be able to go and take this transmitter apart. But there is an ending to the story, of course. You know, we talked about the AWA. Well, DL-8 has a new home. DL-8's home is in Bloomfield, New York, at the Antique Wireless Museum. And here you see the display they've put together, which is just a beautiful display. You see the control console there on the left, and you see the modulator and the transmitter control panel there on the right, and a scale model of one of the antenna arrays. So what a wonderful thing the AWA did, and has prominently displayed this transmitter, and it's preserved there for everyone to see and hear the story of the Voice of America. So with that, we're going to move on to the questions and answers, Q&A. There's kind of an overall shot, late afternoon of the site. And we will now terminate this slideshow and move on to Q&A. Thanks very much, guys. Really appreciate this. I hope you all enjoyed the talk here, and look forward to the questions.